اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على Muhammad وآل Muhammad. We're reciting Dua Nudba on our behalf, on behalf of our community, on behalf of all those present, our families, our marhumin, kurbatan ilallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin Nabiyyihi wa alihi wa sallam taslima. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. اللهم لك الحمد على ما جرى به قضاؤك في أوليائك الذين استخلصتهم لنفسك ودينك، إذ اخترت لهم جزيل ما عندك من النعيم المقيم الذي لا زوال له ولا إذمهلال، بعد أن شرطت عليهم زهدا في درجات هذه الدنيا الدنية وزخرفها وزبرجها، فشرطوا لك ذلك وعلمت منهم الوفاء به، فقبلتهم وقربتهم وقدمت لهم الذكر العلية والثناء الجلية، وأهبطت عليهم ملائكتك وكرمتهم بوحيك ورفدتهم بعلمك وجعلتهم الذريعة إليك والوسيلة إلى رضوانك، فبعضا أسكنته جنتك إلى أن أخرجته منها، وبعضا حملته في فلقك ونجيته ومن آمن معه من الهلكة برحمتك، وبعضا اتخذته لنفسك خليلا وسألك لسان صدق في الآخرين فعجبته وجعلت ذلك عليا، وبعضا كلمته من شجرة تكليما وجعلته من أخيه ردءا ووزيرا، وبعضا أولدته من غير أب وآتيته البينات وأيدته بروح القدس، وكل شرعت له شريعة ونهجت له منهاج وتخيرت له أوصياء، مستحفظا بعد مستحفظ من مدة إلى مدة، إقامة لدينك وحجة على عبادك، ولئلا يزول الحق عن مقره ويغلب الباطل على أهله، ولا يقول أحد لولا أرسلت إلينا رسولا منذرا وأقمت لنا علما هاديا فنتبع آيتك من قبل أن نضل ونخزى، إلى أن انتهيت بالأمر إلى حبيبك ونجيبك محمد صلى الله عليه وآله، فكان كما انتجبته سيد من خلقته وصفوة من استفيته وأفضل من اجتبيته وأكرم من اعتمدته، قدمته على أنبيائك وبعثته إلى الثقلين من عبادك، وأوتأته مشارقك ومغاربك، وسخرت له البراق وأرجت بروحه إلى السماء، وأودعته علم ما كان وما يكون إلى انقضاء خلقك، ثم نصرته بالرعب وحففته بجبرائيل وميكائيل والمسومين من ملائكتك، ووعدته أن تظهر دينه على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون، وذلك بعد أن بوأته مبوأ صدق من أهله، وجعلت له ولهم أول بيت وضع للناس للذي ببكة مباركة وهدى للعالمين، فيه آيات بينات مقام إبراهيم، ومن دخله كان آمنا، وقلت إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ثم جعلت أجر محمد صلواتك عليه وآله مودتهم في كتابك، فقلت قل لا أسألكم عليه أجرا إلا المودة في القربى، وقلت ما سألتكم من أجر فهو لكم، وقلت ما أسألكم عليه من أجر إلا من شاء أن يتخذ إلى ربه سبيلا، فكانوا هم السبيل إليك والمسلك إلى رضوانك، فلما انقضت أيامه أقام وليه علي بن أبي طالب صلواتك عليهما وآلهما هاديا، إذ كان هو المنذر ولكل قوم هاد، فقال والملأ أمامه من كنت مولاه فعلي مولاه، اللهم وال من والاه وعاد من عاداه، وانصر من نصره واخذل من خذله، وقال من كنت أنا نبيه فعلي أميره، وقال أنا وعلي من شجرة واحدة وسائر الناس من شجر شتى، وأحله محل هارون من موسى، فقال له: أنت مني بمنزلة هارون من موسى، إلا أنه لا نبي بعدي. وزوجه ابنته سيدة النساء العالمين، وحل له من مسجده ما حل له، وسد الأبواب إلا بابه، ثم أودعه علمه وحكمته، فقال: أنا مدينة العلم وعلي بابها، فمن أراد المدينة والحكمة فليأتها من بابها. ثم قال: أنت أخي ووسي ووارثي، لحمك من لحمي ودمك من دمي، وسلمك سلمي وحربك حربي، والإيمان مخالطه لحمك ودمك كما خالط لحمي ودمي. وأنت غدا على الحوض خليفتي، وأنت تقضي ديني وتنجز عداتي، وشيعتك على منابر من نور، مبيضة وجوههم حولي في الجنة وهم جيراني. ولولا أنت يا علي لم يعرف المؤمنون بعدي، وكان بعده هدى من الضلال ونورا من العمى، وحبل الله المتين وصراطه المستقيم، لا يسبق بقرابة في رحم ولا بسابقة في الدين، ولا يلحق في منقبة من مناقبه يحظو حظ الرسول صلى الله عليهما وآلهما، ويقاتل على التأويل ولا تأخذه في الله لومة لائم، قد وتر فيه سناديد العرب، وقتل أبطالهم وناوش ذؤبانهم، فأودع قلوبهم أحقادا بدرية وخيبرية وهنينية وغيرهن، فضبت على عداوته وكبت على منابذته، حتى قتل الناكثين والقاسدين والمارقين. ولما قضى نحبه وقتله أشكى الآخرين يتبع أشكى الأولين، لم يمتثل أمر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله في الهادين بعد الهادين، والأمة مصرة على مقته، مجتمعة على قطيعة الرحم وإقصاء ولده، إلا القليل ممن وفى لرعاية الحق فيهم، فقتل من قتل، وسبي من سبي، وأقصي من أقصي، وجرى القضاء لهم بما يرجى له حسن المثوبة، إذ كانت الأرض لله يورثها من يشاء من عباده، والعاقبة للمتقين. وسبحان ربنا إن كان وعد ربنا لمفعولا، ولن يخلف الله وعده وهو العزيز الحكيم. فعلى العتائب من أهل محمد وعلي صلى الله عليهما وآلهما فليبكي الباكون، وإياهم فليندب النادبون، ولمثلهم فلتذرف الدموع، وليصرخ الصارخون، ويضج الضاجون، ويعج العاجون. أين الحسن؟ أين الحسين؟ أين أبناء الحسين؟ صالح بعد الصالح، وصادق بعد الصادق. أين السبيل بعد السبيل؟ أين الخيرة بعد الخيرة؟ أين الشموس طالعة؟ أين الأقمار المنيرة؟ أين أنجم الظاهرة؟ أين أعلام الدين وقواعد العلم؟ أين بقية الله التي لا تخلو من الإترة العادية؟ أين المعد لقطع دابر الظلمة؟ أين المنتظر لإقامة العمت والعوج؟ أين المرتجى لإزالة الجور والعدوان؟ أين المدخر لتجديد الفرائض والسنن؟ أين المتخير لإعادة الملة والشريعة؟ أين المؤمل لإحياء الكتاب وهدوده؟ أين محيي معالم الدين وأهله؟ أين قاسم شوكة المعتدين؟ أين هادم أبنية الشرق والنفاق؟ أين مبيد أهل الفسوق والإسيان والطغيان؟ أين حاسد فروع الغي والشقاق؟ أين طامس آثار الزيغ والأهواء؟ أين قاطئ حبائل الكذب والافتراء؟ أين المبيد العتاة والمرضى؟ أين المستأصل الأهل العناد والتضليل والإلحاد؟ أين المعز الأولياء ومضل الأعداء؟ أين جامع الكلمة على التقوى؟ أين باب الله الذي منه يؤتى؟ أين وجه الله الذي إليه يتوجه الأولياء؟ أين السبب المتصل بين الأرض والسماء؟ أين صاحب يوم الفتح وناشر الراية الهدى؟ أين مؤلف شمل الصلاح والرضا؟ أين طالب بذهول الأنبياء وأبناء الأنبياء؟ أين طالبون بدم المقتول بكربلاء؟ أين المنصور على من اعتدى عليه وافترى؟ أين المضطر الذي يجاب إذا دعا؟ أين صدر الخلائق ذو البر والتقوى؟ أين ابن النبي المصطفى وابن علي المرتضى وابن خديجة الغراء وابن فاطمة الكبرى؟ بأبي أنت وأمي ونفسي لك الوقاء والحمى، يا ابن السادة المقربين، يا ابن النجباء الأكرمين، يا ابن الهداة المهديين، يا ابن الخيرة المحذبين، يا ابن الغطارفة الأنجبين، يا ابن الأطايب المتهرين، يا ابن الغضارمة المنتجبين، يا ابن القماقمة الأكرمين، يا ابن البدور المنيرة، يا ابن السرج الواضحة، يا ابن الشهب الثاقبة، يا ابن الأنجم الزاهرة، يا ابن السبل الواضحة، يا ابن الأعلام اللائحة، يا ابن العلوم الكاملة، يا ابن السنن المشهورة، يا ابن المعالم المأثورة، يا ابن المعجزات الموجودة، يا ابن الدلائل المشهودة، يا ابن الصراط المستقيم، يا ابن النبأ العظيم، يا ابن من هو في أم الكتاب لدى الله علي حكيم، يا ابن الآيات والبينات، يا ابن الدلائل الظاهرات، يا ابن البراهين الواضحات الباهرات، يا ابن الحجج البالغات، يا ابن النعم السابغات، يا ابن تاها والمحكمات، يا ابن ياسين والضاريات، يا ابن تور والعاديات، يا ابن من دنا فتدلى فكان قاب قوسين أو أدنى دنوا واقترابا من العلي الأعلى. ليت شعري أين استقرت بك النوى، بل أي أرض تقلك أو ثرى، أبي رضوى أو غيرها أمضي توى. عزيز علي أن أرى الخلق ولا ترى، ولا أسمع لك حسيسا ولا نجوى. عزيز علي أن تحيط بك دوني البلوى، ولا ينالك مني ضجيجا ولا شكوى. بنفسي أنت من مغيب لم يخلو منا، بنفسي أنت من نازه ما نزح عنا. بنفسي أنت أمنية الشائق يتمنى من مؤمن ومؤمنة ذكر فحنا. بنفسي أنت من عقيد إز لا يسامى، بنفسي أنت من أثيل مجد لا يجارى. بنفسي أنت من تلاد نعم لا تضاهى، بنفسي أنت من نسيف شرف لا يساوى. إلى متى أحار فيك يا مولاي، وإلى متى، وأي خطاب أسف فيك وأي نجوى. عزيز علي أن أجاب دونك وأناغى، عزيز علي أن أبكيك ويخذلك الورى. عزيز علي أن يجري عليك دونهم ما جرى. هل من معين فأطيل معه العويل والبكاء، هل من جزوع فأساعد جزعه إذا خلا. هل قضيت عين فساعدتها عيني على القضاء، هل إليك يا ابن أحمد سبيل فتلقى. هل يتصل يومنا منك بعدة فنحظى، متى نرد مناهلك الروية فنروى. متى ننتقئ من عذب مائك فقد طال السدى، متى نغاديك ونراوحك فنقر عينا. متى ترانا ونراك وقد نشرت اللواء النصر، ترانا نحف بك وأنت تؤم الملأ، وقد ملأت الأرض عدلا وأذقت أعداءك الحوانا وإقابا، وعبرت العتاة وجحدت الحق وقطعت دابر المتكبرين واجتثثت أصول الظالمين. ونحن نقول الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم أنت كشاف الكرب والبلوى، وإليك أستعدي فعندك العدوى، وأنت رب الآخرة ودنيا. فأغيث يا غياث المستغيثين عبيدك المبتلى، وعره سيده يا شديد القوى، وعزل عنه به العسى والجوى، وبرد غليله يا من على العرش استوى، ومن إليه رجعى والمنتهى. اللهم ونحن عبيدك التائقون إلى وليك المذكر بك وبنبيك خلقته لنا اسمة وملاذا، وأقمته لنا قواما ومعاذا، وجعلته للمؤمنين منا إماما، فبلغه منا تحية والسلاما، وزدنا بذلك يا ربي إكراما، واجعل مستقره لنا مستقرا ومقاما، وأتمم نعمتك بتقديمك إياه أمامنا حتى توردنا جنانك ومرافقة الشهداء من خلصائك. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد، وصل على محمد جده ورسولك سيد الأكبر، وعلى أبيه سيد الأصغر، وجدته الصديقة الكبرى فاطمة بنت محمد صلى الله عليه وآله، وعلى من استفيت من آبائه البررة، وعليه أفضل وأكمل وأتم وأدوم وأكثر وأوفر ما صليت على أحد من أسفيائك وخيرتك من خلقك. وصل عليه صلاة لا غاية لعددها ولا نهاية لمددها ولا نفاد لأمدها. اللهم وأقم به الحق، وادحذ به الباطل، وادل به أولياك، واذلل به أعداك. وصل اللهم بيننا وبينه وصلة تؤدي إلى مرافقة سلفه، واجعلنا ممن يأخذ بحجزتهم ويمكث في ذلهم، وعنا على تأتية حقوقه إليه والاجتهاد في طاعته واجتناب معصيته، وامن علينا برضاه، وهب لنا رأفته ورحمته ودعاءه وخيره ما ننال به سعة من رحمتك وفوزا عندك، واجعل صلاتنا به مقبولة، وذنوبنا به مغفورة، ودعاءنا به مستجابة، واجعل أرزاقنا به مبسوطة، وهمومنا به مقفية، وحوائجنا به مقضية، واقبل إلينا بوجهك الكريم، واقبل تقربنا إليك، وانظر إلينا نظرة رحيمة نستكمل بها الكرامة عندك، ثم لا تصرف عنا بجودك، واسقنا من حوض جده صلى الله عليه وآله بكأسه وبيده ريا رويا حنيا سائغا لا ظمأ بعده يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. From amongst the mustahabbat is 2 rakat salat, qada al-haja for dua nudba, kurbatan ilallah.
لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. توكلت على الحي الذي لا يموت. والحمد لله الذي لم يتخذ صاحبة ولا ولدا ولم يكن له شريك في الملك ولم يكن له ولي من الذل وكبره تكبيرا. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله جل جلاله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله جل جلاله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. على محمد. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. اللهم صل على محمد. أشهد أن مولانا أمير المؤمنين عليا ولي الله صلوات الله والسلام. أشهد أن مولانا أمير المؤمنين عليا حجة الله صلوات الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. حي على خير العمل. حي على خير العمل. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وسلم. صل على
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد صلى الله على محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين واللعنة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. Amma ba'd, respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah for the barakat of the day of Friday, the day of Eid for the mu'mineen, a day that we continue our learning in relationship with the Holy Quran. In our discussion, we've come to the conversation in Surah Al-Mudaththir, and we've reached the 11th verse. Previous verses we were mentioning how Allah was warning about the conditions of hell. Now Allah shifts his conversation. ذَرْنِي وَمَنْ خَلَقْتُ وَحِيدًا. Leave me to deal with whom I created alone. This wahida and who I created alone has four possible meanings to it. The first of these is literally to say that Allah is the one who created his being alone, and Allah is the one who will alone deal with it. The second interpretation comes from context, where Allah says, ذَرْنِي وَمَنْ خَلَقْتُ وَحِيدًا. Leave me and the one who I created alone, meaning that the creation was alone in the womb, was alone without any resources, was alone without any benefits. And then Allah continues, وَجَعَلْتَ لَهُ مَالًا مَمْدُودًا. And that I gave him a great amount of wealth. وَبَنِينَ شَهُودًا. And children who were along his side. وَمَهَدْتُ لَهُ تَمْهِيدًا. And facilitated all matters for him. That Allah is describing and saying he was alone, and then I gave him wealth, and then I gave him children, and then I made easy for him the affairs of this world. This is the second interpretation. That you began alone, and then eventually you went through and gained all these benefits, all from the Creator. The third of these, and the fourth, tie specifically to one personality who is known as Mughira, Walid ibn Mughira. Walid ibn Mughira is a figure in history who was one of the leaders of the Quraysh and the enemies of our Holy Prophet. One of his titles of honor and his honorifics was Al-Wahid, that he was the one who known as the One. He was known as the moon of the Quraysh, meaning in handsomeness and beauty they considered him to be of a great and high status, and that he was unique amongst the qawm, amongst the people, hence he was called Al-Wahid. So Allah is specifying in the third interpretation of this verse, ذَرْنِي وَمَنْ خَلَقْتُ وَحِيدًا. Leave me to deal with the one who was created, known as Wahida, that I created and is known as Wahida. The fourth also refers to Walid ibn Mughira, but instead of Wahid being an honorific of him, rather is an exposure of the indecent history of Walid, that Wahid was one of the titles or one of the names, Al-Wahid, to the one who did not know who his father was. That Walid al-Wahid would mean Walid, the one who was born out of wedlock, and that his father is unknown to him. And that Allah is referring to Walid in this context. The reason that this conversation and this discussion that begins in verse number 11 goes all the way to verse number 30, talking specifically about Walid. The event that leads this conversation pertaining to Walid, we mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, in the beginning of the discussion around this surah, that the surah talks about Walid ibn Mughira and how he made difficult the life of the Prophet and how he created challenges for the Prophet. Now Walid as a person was someone who was very honored by the Quraysh, was considered one of their leaders, had all of the wealth and resources, and was above need and question for anything. And that whenever the Quraysh wanted to look at something or have an opinion, they would ask the opinion of Walid. It so happens that as the message of Islam began its propagation, our Prophet began teaching the people about the religion of Islam. Walid happened to be sitting by the Prophet one day when he heard the starting of the verses of Surah Al-Ghafir, where Allah begins and introduces Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Hamim, تنزيل الكتاب من الله العزيز العليم غافر الذنب وقابل التوبة شديد العقاب. The beauty of these verses, Walid was overcome. And Walid came back to the Prophet after he heard them and he says, repeat that to me. And the Prophet repeated it. And Walid got lost in thought at the beauty of the verses recited by the Holy Prophet and walked away and secluded himself for a period of time. The consequence of this seclusion was that people began to imagine and think that Walid, being overcome by the verses of the Quran, was now intending to leave the Quraysh and join the company of the Holy Prophet. So the people became curious and worried and started to whisper amongst themselves that our leader is going to join the Prophet Muhammad. So Abu Lahab goes to visit him. And Abu Lahab calls him and speaks to him and he says, Walid, you are our leader. You are the best of us. What's going on? Walid says, what I've heard is unlike anything else. What I've heard is something unique and different. But you see, Walid was not planning on converting from this. Rather, Walid was so adamant in his ignorance that he was looking for a way to actually combat and defeat these verses. That he realized that if any normal person who wasn't as staunch of a disbeliever or as staunch of a pagan as Walid could be overcome by these verses of the Quran, their beauty, their message, their teaching, and their comprehensiveness. So Walid was thinking of a way of somehow defeating the Holy Prophet, not following the Holy Prophet. This is one of the mistakes that we should also pay attention to in our own lives, is that are we trying to force our worldview or our view of a situation instead of the reality that exists outside? Are we so adamant to make what we believe to be true that we will fight the reality that exists in the world and refuse to acknowledge and accept what is apparently not bad and good? Many times there are changes in our lives, in our cultures, in our communities, in our families, in our environment that disagree with norms that we may have lived our entire life according to. And what happens? Instead of giving the opportunity to accept those new things, we fight against them, even if it's not a good thing to fight against them. Our child brings home a spouse that we weren't expecting. We hate that person for the rest of their life. Our child picks a major that we didn't want them to. Or we lose in a business that we thought and our forefathers were involved in for all of their history. We've been boat makers. And suddenly we lose out on boat making, and then every other profession is horrible that could exist. These fightings of reality are signs of the staunchness of ignorance, not of guidance. At times, as the world changes, as long as our values and our iman are solid, the rest of the world can change. Walid, however, even recognizing the fact that there was truth in front of him, said, I refuse to accept this. And Walid, having all of this wealth and possession, died as an ignorant, poor pagan. It's reported that Walid had over 10 sons. Some even say 13 sons, others say 7 sons. All of them died and none of his lineage remained except for 3 who accepted Islam. And even those who accepted Islam, well, one of them was Khalid ibn Walid, who's known as Saif al-Islam, but was one of the enemies of Ahlul Bayt. The acceptance of Islam, even from the sons of Walid, in some of these examples, was the kind of people who truly didn't accept, but rather submitted to the fact that the overwhelming power of Islam had grown to the point that they couldn't compete with it. So here, Walid, listening to these verses of Surah Al-Ghafir, and being staunch in his disbelief, and Abu Lahab questioning, oh Walid, have you left us? Have you joined the faith of Islam? Walid says, no, I was thinking, how do we combat this religion? So Walid gathers all of the leaders of the Quraysh and sits down and he says, listen, we have to combat this. Let me ask you. And he asks them a question. Can anyone vouch and say that Muhammad is crazy? And they said, no, we can't, because he makes sense and he doesn't behave in a fashion that aligns with a person who is crazy. So Walid then asks, can we say he is a kahin, a soothsayer, meaning he's someone who foretells the future? And they replied, no, because sometimes he talks about the past, sometimes he talks about the future, sometimes he talks about the current. His words are not only associated with the future, such that if we said he talks about the future and he's a kahin, people may ignore the conversation about the future, but when they listen to his words about the past, they may be overcome by his description and his explanation. So Walid continues and he says, can you say he's a poet? And he doesn't even know it. Now, the answer comes, no, we can't say he's a poet, because poetry speaks of only love or speaks only of war, and Muhammad speaks of everything. His speech does not align with the words of the poets, therefore it would not work. Can we call him a liar for what he speaks about? And they said, no. Muhammad, before he even established the religion of Islam, was known as a sadiq, al-amin, the truthful, the trustworthy, that it'll be impossible that if we call him a liar, people will refuse to accept it. So Walid says, I have a solution then to stop the message of Islam. And they said, Walid, what did you come up with? And he says, we will call him a magician, a sorcerer. And I said, why a magician? Why a sorcerer? And he says, what do magicians and sorcerers in that time, what they were associated with was breaking apart and joining people. That if you wanted someone to love you, you would go to a sorcerer for a love potion or something to that effect, or some kind of a spell. Or if you wanted to break up two people, you would go to a sorcerer of that time and wait for that sorcerer to cast a spell to break up two people. And he says, what the message of Islam is doing is breaking our households and making unity amongst people that otherwise had no relationship. This is the attribute of a magician. So we will call him a magician. This action of Walid creating and it's a very intellectually sound plan to try and destroy the message of Islam. That's so much so that Allah addresses him now. And which is why we talk about ذَرْنِي وَمَنْ خَلَقْتُ وَحِيدًا. Leave me to the one who I created alone, the one who I created and who is known as Al-Wahid, whether as an honorific or whether as an insult to his character. That Allah is specifying that this next conversation that he begins is about the consequences of the actions of Walid ibn Mughira. وَجَعَلْتَ لَهُ مَالًا مَمْدُودًا. Mamduda means something that is expanded and full in an expanse, and Allah describes, and He says that this Walid, I created alone. I created that I alone am his source of creation. I am the one who created him alone with nothing. And then I gave him, وَجَعَلْتَ لَهُ مَالًا مَمْدُودًا, and I gave him a great amount of wealth. Walid was incredibly wealthy. وَبَنِينَ شَهُودًا, and children who would bear witness or be present with him. The description of Walid's wealth was such that all of his children, all 10 of his sons, or 7 of his sons, or 13 of his sons, depending upon who the source of the narration is, never traveled to go do work. They never left his side. So when Allah describes and says, وَبَنِينَ شَهُودًا, is referring to the fact that Allah gave him so much resources that his children all were constantly present with him and never had to go out and away from him to earn a living and to earn a status. That Allah gave him that much. وَمَهَدْتُ لَهُ تَمْهِيدًا, and facilitated all matters for him. That this one man had access to every resource, had access to the leadership of the Quraysh, was in a position of authority. ثُمَّ يَتْمَعُ أَنْ أَزِيدَ, and yet still in spite of all of this, and is despising and refusing to acknowledge the presence of Allah, he was still eager that he should receive even more in his life. That his greed was without intellect. One of the important things for all of us to remember is that, okay, fine, we may have, and Allah may give us, and He has given us. He's given us access to safety, security, resources, where even as a community or as a society, those living in America have better access to health, better access to cleanliness, better access to resources than anywhere else in the world, really. He has given us. Do we appreciate what we've received, or are we always conscious of what we haven't gotten? Sometimes there's one thing that we don't have in our life, and we ignore everything else until we get that one thing. And here in the same concept, that this Walid was someone who, though he possessed everything, today even, it's impossible for someone to say that all of my children can stay with me, they don't have to go out and work, and I can have them in my company, and my wealth is expanded over large periods and lands, mamdud, where I don't have to worry about anything. And yet still we be greedy for more without acknowledging everything that we've received. Allah is describing His attribute of that of a pagan, that of someone who doesn't truly believe in Allah, is that he has a lot, but he refuses to acknowledge Allah and demands and insists for more. Such that then Allah continues and He says, ثُمَّ يَتْمَعُ أَنْ أَزِيدَ, and he is still eager for more. كَلَّا, certainly no, I will not give him more. I will not raise his status any more further than what he already possesses. This kalla of Allah is a description and explanation to say that everything that Walid possessed, everything that he had, would be wasted in this life and it would never increase. And certainly Walid is one of those stories of, instead of rags to riches, riches to rags. That Walid had a lot of wealth and a lot of possession, but before he died in a state of penury and disgrace, with nothing in his possession, no honor, no position. Where Allah describes and He says, إِنَّهُ كَانَ لِآيَاتِنَا عَنِيدًا, that he is the one who is obstinate, opponent of our signs. That this refusal of Walid to accept and acknowledge Allah would be the process of his downfall and losing of all that he possessed. It's a lesson for us too. Sometimes it's true, we want something in life, we want to attain a greater status. But if we don't acknowledge all the good things that we have, and we become lost in that one item that Allah has not given us, it's possible that Allah can continue to remove all of the blessings that He's given us. That if this isn't valuable to you, let me take it away. If this isn't valuable to you, I'll take this away as well. And you lose those benefits that you possessed and thought and took for granted, such that Allah says, إِنَّهُ كَانَ لِآيَاتِنَا عَنِيدًا, that if you are obstinate, if you're an enemy of Allah's signs, then there's no reason for you to possess Allah's bounties and blessings. سَأَرْحِقُهُ سَعُودًا. Allah now describes the punishment of Walid in hell. And He says, soon I will overwhelm him with hardship. This sa'uda, this hardship, it could be in maddiyat, in dunya, or in akhirat. What the description says, that the mufassirin point to and say, that the Arabic word of sa'uhriquhu, first off, is derived from one who is to cover over and to be overcome, and connotates in overburdening and afflicting one with different torments, not specifying dunya or akhirah. And then for sa'uda is a place or something that is referred to as climbing up a hard and difficult journey. That Allah is describing and saying, سَأُحْرِقُهُ سَعُودًا, that I will overcome him with hardships that he's constantly struggling in the face of in this world or the hereafter. In the hereafter, the Mufassirin describe and say, Sa'uda describes a mountain in the fires of hell that will be a unique punishment for this Walid, for the actions that he committed against the Holy Prophet, where he will continuously climb up this one particular mountain, and every time he tries to reach up further and higher, the ground from under his hands will slip, and he will struggle to even maintain the position he has. And that it will be his punishment that he will continuously be climbing up this mountain. Other Mufassirin described and said it will be a mountain that is very slippery, and it will be his punishment in hell that he will have to climb up this mountain. Others go still further to describe and say that this punishment that Walid will attain will be one where he will be chained and pulled and dragged up a mountain as he is being clubbed from behind, that he has to continue on this arduous struggle for making the struggle of the Prophet harder, for having to give the message of Islam. In this way, Allah takes the time to describe and say that these punishments, and the same thing, سَأُحْرِقُهُ سَعُودًا, is not to say specifically that this will only happen in the hereafter, but rather the reality of the statement of Allah is that it describes and says that this is one who, because of his obstinate disobedience and creating hardship in fighting against the message of Islam, it's not unusual to believe that his punishment would be in dunya and in akhirah. We ask Allah, by the right of this day, by the right of the hadirin ghaibin, that, oh Allah, protect us from being those who are the enemies of Islam. Oh Allah, keep us rightly guided on the message of Islam. Ya Allah, keep the message of Islam and of the Holy Quran in our hearts and in the hearts of our families and our generations. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal asr, innal insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilu s-salihat, wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل وسلم على أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب وفاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين، والحسن والحسين سيد شباب أهل الجنة، وعلي بن الحسين زين العابدين، ومحمد بن علي باقر علم النبيين، وجعفر بن محمد الصادق، وموسى بن جعفر الكاظم، وعلي بن موسى الرضا، ومحمد بن علي الجواد، وعلي بن محمد الهادي، والحسن بن علي الأسكري، وحجة الله ابن الحسن يا صاحب العصر والزمان. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. عجل الله تعالى فرجه وسهل الله تعالى مخرجه وظهوره، وجعلنا من أعوانه والأنصاره والمستشهدين بين يديه. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات، تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات، إنك مجيب الدعوات، إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله. Enjoin upon you and myself to have fear and piety of Allah. Briefly, in our second discussion, there's something unique that humanity possesses in the attribute of what's called the imagination or the wahm. The imagination is something that's incredibly beneficial in the sense that it gives man the ability to think about, to come together with, and to create fascinating tools, resources, whether these projectors, these iPads, these phones. 50 years ago, if you imagine that you can keep a device in your pocket that can give you information about anything and everything and give you news around the world in an instant, we would have said you're lying, you're joking. The riwayat that would talk about that there will come a time where a man in the East will be able to see and ask the condition of a mu'min in the West and know his affairs and dealings. People used to wonder and imagine, how could this happen? And the tool of imagination was something beneficial and great that gave us the ability to imagine, to take raw materials that exist on this earth and come together and create tools and resources that allow us to change the world and look at the world differently and have knowledge and information that is unimaginable. But the same way as there is every attribute that has goodness in it, every attribute also has a danger of corruption. And the corruption of the imagination is something that we were warned about from the Ahlul Bayt many times. I'll give you an example. In a hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, التوحيد ألا تتوهمه. Allah's divine unity is worthy such that you should not subject Him to the limitations of your imagination. That Tawheed cannot be truly represented in humanity until we recognize that our imagination cannot encompass who is Allah and what is Allah. In this light, our eighth Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Rida alayhi salam, in trying to explain one of the verses of the Quran, a companion who was having a conversation, the Imam asks him, when Allah describes and he says, لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار, where the Imam says, Allah makes a statement that eyes cannot see Him, but He can see every sight and every eyes. What does this mean? The Imam asks one of the companions. And the companion replies, he says, well, this means that, لا تدركه الأبصار, eyes, absar, eyes, cannot see Allah, but Allah can see everything that eyes see. And the Imam replies, he says, no, it's more vast than this. The eyes of the imagination are greater than the eyes that we possess in our head. And the eyes of the imagination can come up with ideas that a land that you have never seen, you can have an image in your mind of that place. And you can create and design things in your mind that don't even exist in reality. Allah is describing when He says, La tudrikuhu al-absar, He's talking about the eyes of the imagination. That your imagination can never encompass Him, yet Allah is the one who is aware of everything that exists in your imagination. Meaning Allah's knowledge of a person is not simply what He physically does, but even what exists in his mind, Allah is well aware of every detail and aspect of that. This discussion of imagination and why the Ahlul Bayt would discuss this wahm was to teach people and to warn them that imagination has a limitation. Don't exceed the bounds to imagine that Allah is something that can be encompassed or can be controlled or known to you in your mind even. The problem is, society's doing that today. They're trying to create Allah, a creator, a khaliq, in a way that can be encompassed and understood, and that the imagination goes to far-fetched extremes to kind of bring to reality something that is beyond reality. And the problem is that this corruption of imagination is something that we're taking without thinking about it. You see, these movies, these books that talk about these pagan gods, and if you notice, in media, pagan theology is coming and making a strong comeback, because before it used to just be words on a page, and if someone read it, maybe they'd be influenced or their imagination would take hold. But now that they can create these movies and these images, and they can create a pagan god that exists on a screen, it creates the mental idea in the mind of a child that God can be represented in this fashion and God can look like this. And the imagination becomes corrupted to try and limit Allah. And it goes not just from limiting Allah, but limiting the concepts of theology to things that I can imagine to have happened and to be over and done with. we enjoy and we appreciate that we've come to the point where our minds have created these tools and these media systems that can create very realistic, very authentic stories that we can physically see now instead of just imagining in our mind. And we're fascinated by the idea that if I read it as a book, now I can see it, and someone brings it to light and creates an image of it. But we have to be careful that this imagination, if it gets lost in these ideas, in these Harry Potters, and in these Marvels, and in these other ideas of taking things that are outside concepts, and in our mind it becomes real, we stop the reliance on Allah and believing that there is a power greater than our imagination, there is something greater than we possess. And we imagine that if I can think it, it must be able to be happen, and Allah is limited within this reality. As an adult, you may be able to control this theory. You may be able to control this reality of knowing that no, what I have read and know about Allah is greater than what I'm seeing on TV or seeing in movies or seeing in books even. But our next generation is susceptible to these things because their mentality hasn't matured yet. And we can destroy that relationship with Allah before it even builds by imagining that Allah does not have the ability and the power. The significance of pointing all this out and building this argument is twofold. One is that if your children are going to watch things in media that overexpose imagination and create things that don't exist in reality on the TV screen, talk to them. Discuss with them, this isn't real. Many children build their emotional expectations upon what they see in TV and movies. And the reality is TV and movies don't reflect what's really real. They reflect extreme, weird examples because reality is boring. And a boring reality doesn't make for a good movie. So they come up with crazy ideas. And your child begins to think that that's reality. You constantly have to deprogram this process of showing them and teaching them what elements of imagination don't fit into our life and don't make sense, and not to build values on them. Or the other option is don't show them this. Don't give them exposure to these things. The other point is that this what-if structure of imagination in us affects us as well too. That by seeing these what-if realities that exist, we begin to apply those what-if theories to our own lives. For example, a question that started this entire conversation was a person very seriously sitting down and saying, Maulana, you know, I believe in Imam Zaman, I believe in everything Allah said, I believe that everything is true in the Quran, but what if Imam Zaman already came and left? His what if took control of him and he just basically decided, okay, fine, we're waiting for someone who's been over 1,000 years. What if it already happened, it's over with, and we're now living in the post-Imam era of this existence? Without thinking about the consequences of what that statement means. Right? One of the responsibilities of the Imam is to execute the promises of the Quran and to establish on this earth the equity and fair treatment and justice that the Quran has demanded will exist on this earth. An Imam cannot come and leave this land, this final Imam, his responsibility is to complete the execution of those promises. If we haven't seen this earth filled with equity and people live according to the values of Islam and justice to be filled in this earth, يَمْلَأُ الْأَرْضَ عَدْلًا وَقِسْتًا كَمَا مُلِعَتْ ظُلْمًا وَجَوْرًا. That the role of that Imam was to establish peace and justice in this earth so completely in the same way that it was filled with oppression and injustice prior to his coming. Have we seen that? No. But I can't control the what if in somebody's mind, and that consequence of not asking that, if that person didn't ask me, that theory in his mind would continue to play out, that what if the Imam already came and went? And then he would say, what am I waiting for? What is the point of this message? Reality is over and done with, there's nothing here for us. And he would destroy that message of his faith within his own mind and never have that opportunity. Imagination is useful. It's important to possess, but within its balance and in its purpose. There are places where imagination should be applied in the creation of new devices and looking at technology and looking at how to facilitate humanity and to improve the existence of man as it's present on this earth. But it doesn't belong in the places of theology. It doesn't belong in the places of trying to comprehend God. It doesn't belong in the places of questioning the reality that Allah has presented. When we see imagination impacting those areas, it means that our education about faith is insufficient. And if we don't invest in this, we will become lost in the generations that come. So it's important, be conscious, be careful. The same way we're conscious of our diet in food. Be conscious in your diet of what you consume in terms of media. And that is on many, many levels. Some of those things are lies. Some of those things are indecency. And some of those things are even the excessiveness of imagination. Be careful with this process. We ask Allah again by the right of this day, by the right of the Hadirin Ghaibin, that, oh Allah, first and foremost, forgive our sins and cover our flaws. Ya Allah, by the barakat of this day, we have gathered here with hajat, by the right of the Quran, by the right of the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, fulfill our hajat. Oh Allah, there are those amongst our families, our communities, the mu'mineen who are suffering through sickness and disease. Ya Allah, give shafa'at to the mu'mineen wherever they are. Oh Allah, those who suffer through strife and insecurity, give aman to the mu'mineen, muslimin wherever they are. Ya Allah, keep our children on the upright path of Islam. Ya Allah, hasten the reappearance of Sahibul Zaman. Entitle us and our families to be from the upright supporters of Sahibul Zaman. And entitle us the ziyarat of Imam Hussein in this world, and the shifa of Imam Hussein in the hereafter. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Inna Allah ya'muru bil-adli wal-ihsani wa ita'i dhil qurba wa yanha 'anil fahsha'i wal-munkar wal-baghi ya'idhukum la'allakum tadhakkarun. Sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. أعوذ بالله